Thank you, everyone. One of the things I want to take a second is to congratulate the moderators and panelists from the earlier sessions. When Carlos and I were conceiving this conference, one of the things we said is that if we just got kind of 40 or 50 or 60 of the people we really want here to be part of this conversation, it would be incredibly useful for us. Carlos and I worked together on some work in Detroit thinking about the innovation economy. And a lot of questions come up about how you grow this economy, how you make it more equitable, these sorts of things. And so we had envisioned pulling together, 40, 50, 60 of our closest colleagues and having this conversation. There clearly is a demand for this conversation because the numbers turned out to be about 3 times bigger than we had initially expected. But the part that did align with what we had initially expected is that I think we both learned a lot from bringing people together for 2 days. So I want to congratulate the moderators from the first 3 sessions. Bruce's talk last night was terrific. I can't wait for Dave Egner's talk on Can Innovation Save Detroit later on today. But great panels, and as I had hoped, really learned a lot from the conversations that have been started here. So we kind of opened the conference on this kind of broad framing session, Carlos's session, Liz Reynolds, John Flavin, Ray Leach. Terrific session on thinking about innovation systems and the overlap with urban economies. And this question of, in my mind at least, is this kind of the moment for US cities to kind of help reset the trajectory for the US economy, which clearly needs kind of a rethinking at this moment. And then went through a couple of practical panels on how we create spaces in cities to promote innovation. And then think about Jennifer Vey's great panel on organizing different stakeholders in cities to really kind of bring these spaces, policies, practices into something that can drive innovation in urban economies. So we're ending today, this is intentional, so there is, we hope, a trajectory here, but ending today with a little bit of a downer, a little bit of a down note, which is a concern that I know Carlos and I share, and I know all the panelists share, which is the potential for the innovation economy to drive rather than address economic and social inequalities in the United States. You're in this room, you read the New York Times, you read the Globe, you read whatever, so I'm sure you have an understanding that the innovation economy historically has been dominated by white populations. Non-white participation is quite low, dominated by male populations, although that has been changing, and has really focused in certain cities, certain parts of the country, on creating jobs for, in some ways, the most educated parts of our population, and so has been a great way to kind of create a lot of opportunity and a lot of great products, a lot of social good, but the economic gains have been somewhat concentrated. And so in this session we want to think about, are there ways to, first of all, hopefully help continue to grow the innovation economy, and recognize that inclusion is probably part of that growth trajectory. But secondly, can we take this kind of moment in the innovation economy, take this moment of urban innovation and use it to address some issues around opportunity and equality. So the panelists today, I'm going to let them introduce themselves, but they bring a broad range of perspectives about thinking about these questions. I'll have each of them introduce themselves and then talk about their work, their perspective on this issue of innovation and inequality. Then we'll have a moderated discussion. By moderated, it means I get to pick the questions, but then we'll open it up to the floor for the last half hour and engage the audience in this.
Trade mics?
We can trade mics.
Thank you. So good afternoon, and thank you, Teresa and Carlos, for pulling all of us together. This is just a great gathering. My name is Bob Weissbourd. I run a little firm called RW Ventures in Chicago. I want to go way further back, though, for a moment as it relates to this panel and my perspective on it. I spent my first 10 years as a civil rights lawyer doing complex federal litigation and representing community organizations. It's kind of an empowerment work, right? My next 10 years at ShoreBank doing development finance, so financing minority entrepreneurs and doing comprehensive neighborhood development. The last 15 years, my firm specializes in assembling national teams of experts, people like Teresa, to develop products and enterprises that drive inclusive market-based growth. I'm a non-resident senior fellow at Brookings, and I work a lot with Bruce. We're co-managing a national project on metropolitan business planning. We're working in about 10 cities right now on comprehensive regional plans that are built around 5 pillars, one of which is innovation. So this is a subject I get exposed to a lot of different activities and types of places I have some strong feelings about, and I don't have a lot of answers. But I want to just quickly, by way of having passed the background, by way of opening statement, address 2 points. One is why we need to care about this, and the second is that how we need to approach it and kind of how we need to get into the details of it. With respect to why we need to care about it, from my point of view, the great challenge and paradox of the knowledge economy is that at the same time the drivers of economic growth make inequality greater, right? Because the returns to capital are increasing faster than the returns to labor. If you own technology, you make more money than if you work, right? And robots are replacing people. It's a more I'm going to simplify and be blunt a lot, and in the conversation we can do Q&A and you can correct me. But basically, the drivers of economic growth are causing inequality. At the same time as the jury is now coming in, that the places with the least inequality do best in the long run. Okay, and no, The Economist, this is not a bastion of liberal thinking. The Economist magazine has been writing a series of articles about work coming out of the International Monetary Fund, work I've done and other people have done in the U.S., work on cities. Categorically, the places with the least inequality do best, and it's because you don't waste your assets, right? You don't bear the high costs of poverty, and you have increased demand for products and services, right? So there are moral, if I'm a civil rights lawyer, there are moral reasons we need to address inequity. My perspective on this today in the context of the innovation economy is not a moral issue. It's an economic imperative. We cannot ultimately succeed if we don't do it in an inclusive way. So that's kind of point one, and we can come back to the nuances of that. Point two is how do you approach it? And I did learn something from my work in the 70s and through decades of other stuff, and this really is in the details, and we all need to take accountability for it. I mean, the fact is, in inadvertent ways, we are on the forefront of this work, and in inadvertent ways, we all are doing things that are exclusive instead of inclusive. And this doesn't always naturally happen. And when I say get into the details, if you can imagine a diagram for me for a minute, imagine a Venn diagram with 3 circles. In one circle, you have research and development institutions, right? You have core invention at universities, at places like Argonne Labs. In a second one, you have industry clusters. You have innovation that happens in industries. And in a third, you have entrepreneurship. And innovation happens to the intersection of these 3 circles. A lot of the innovation we've been talking about has been entrepreneurship, but in fact, the circles reinforce each other, right? And we have to be thinking about all 3 of them. The dynamics of how these circles reinforce each other and whether you succeed or not in being an innovative place are affected by 3 things that are the environment of these circles. One is the networks, and I'm going to return to this strongly, right? It's kind of who's plugged in, right? A second one is the culture. We've heard this earlier today. I've worked in places like Buffalo and Milwaukee, very mature economies. I did a project in the lower Mississippi Delta where the line is that everyone entrepreneurial got up and left 40 years ago. So there are places that culturally are at a different starting point in making this transition to an innovation economy. And the third input that affects these dynamics is talent and money, right? If you look in each of those circles and each of those inputs and think about where are the barriers to inclusion, let me talk about a couple things. First of all, it's not entrepreneurship, right? When I walk into one of these great shared spaces and I hear people say, well, I don't have any blacks here because there aren't any entrepreneurs. I mean, I know, from working at Shorebank, right? Or think about immigrant communities. I mean, America is an entrepreneurial place because we're basically an immigrant community. Israel, so the difference is the entrepreneurs we lent to at Shorebank would get together on Friday morning to network in a coffee shop or a barber shop, and they didn't want to drink cappuccino and sit on pillows, right? Different, and there's nothing wrong with wanting to. I like cappuccino and to sit on pillows, but designing a space around me means you're not going to be as inclusive, right? But the point is the barrier is not that the entrepreneurs aren't there. In industries, a lot of minority participation and success in industries. And I'm sure you'll hear about from Darrin, and the work Shilpa's doing and Ray Leach is doing in Cleveland. We did a project there with Teresa looking at industries in Cleveland. And it's not that there aren't successful minority businesses and industries. less in the high growth industries, right? I mean, historically, more in construction, more in funeral homes, right? Less in biotech, right? So we need to think about, and Cleveland is thinking about, how do we make sure our high growth industries are inclusive? And we need to be deliberate about it. But that's a surmountable barrier. There are other kinds of major systemic barriers, and this is not just about race, obviously, but about class and culture. But it's our culture, not their culture, or it's both cultures, that are long-term, very difficult issues. When I say I don't have solutions, the challenges of the disproportionate representation of minorities in the very highest end technical degrees, for example. But on the other hand, you heard Bruce say 40%, and I think it's actually over 50% of what are considered tech jobs do not require a college degree. Right? The innovation economy is creating huge employment opportunities that do not require a college degree. So we have lots of examples in particular projects and places of how we are getting into each of these circles or into this network issue or the culture issue or the talent issue to figure out what is it about the system in this place that is being exclusive and how do we make it inclusive, and in the conversation we can turn to those. But my two messages are, we all have a stake in addressing this, right? If we don't, what we will have is this little fad of our generation of economic enclaves. This is like a gated community. This is a new, cool, creative little gated community over in the corner that will not be sustainable as an economic matter. So we have to address it. And second, we can address it, but we have to do it kind of every day through everything we do. So that's it. Thanks.
Does this work? Yeah, it is working. Hey, really? Good afternoon. My name is Darrin Redus. I run a company called Main Street Inclusion Advisors. And much like Bob, I'll give a real quick background in terms of how I came to this place. My company is about 6 months old. For the past almost 8 years, was working with a great organization in Cleveland called Jumpstart. My friend Ray is in the back there. And prior to that, was an entrepreneur working with small, mid-sized companies. And prior to that, spent about 15 years in the financial services sector, principally with what was then National City and then Key Corp for some time. And so in that journey, I have really been working with entrepreneurs since about 1988 or so. And what really led to my passion around this space, and even though Teresa mentioned this is a bit of a downer, but I could not be more excited to be having this conversation for a variety of reasons, because I see so much upside, and we'll talk about some of those things. But I recall just a real quick story. What really got my fire lit, so to speak, to really try to address this in the early 90s. For those bankers that might exist, there was a day where bankers actually had lending authority, so you could actually sign off on loans yourself. And so I was one such person at the time in Cleveland, happened to be one of literally a handful of African Americans that had lending authority. And so, as you might imagine, that word traveled, say, you need a loan, go see Darrin, right? And so, in the midst of that, came across a host of opportunities, host of entrepreneurs that really had some compelling things, but you're just not quite ready in certain cases. But the big challenge was, well, where do I send you to really get you ready, particularly for alternative forms of capital, et cetera. And just planted a seed sometime back. They really wanted to try to get out here and really start addressing some of these gaps. But I think it's important, as we talk about, as Bob mentioned, we talk about innovation and entrepreneurship. It's very important to really define, specifically what we're referring to. And when we talk about this innovation space and the three bubbles that Bob mentioned around research and entrepreneurship, et cetera, well, the interaction of those entities is a network. And to no fault of anyone, you do business with folks that you typically know, you've done business with before, folks that you trust. And when we're talking about trying to infuse inclusion into a system that has never really been that inclusive, just think about the process of particularly technology commercialization, as was mentioned, and the process of getting in front of vetting ideas and angel investment and VCs. I mean, the eyeball test alone will tell you that has never really been a very diverse network. And so how do you then infuse, inclusion into that system. So one of the things that we're doing that I'm very excited about, there's a variety of organizations, and let's just call them talent networks, that do exist in the country that originally, quite frankly, came together in most cases back in civil rights times for very different reasons, but still, in fact, are networks to this day. So, for example, you have the National Medical Association, which is 50,000 African American physicians. And so we have recently met with the leadership of that organization, and sure enough, just beginning to kind of survey the members, and you basically begin to bucket that membership of 50,000 folks. You've got folks in there that are aspiring entrepreneurs themselves, medical inventions and such, but not, again, plugged into networks. You have folks in that database that could easily be on someone's angel fund or et cetera, but again, not in those networks. Folks that could join a majority founder, but again, not in those networks. And I could go on and on from the standpoint of Hispanic and African American engineering societies and the American Association of Blacks in Energy and all these groups that exist, but we're now trying to figure out very creative ways to plug them in to this action and this activity that we're talking about. So we're coming at it a little bit differently from the standpoint of, and I'll give kind of three related buckets when we talk about the incubators and accelerators and early stage funds. I mean, ultimately, you care about deal flow, you care about capital, and you care about talent. And what we'll argue is that an inclusion strategy done right will broaden every one of those buckets that you care most about. A more inclusive strategy will get you more deal flow. A more inclusive strategy will get you more follow-on capital. Let me pause there for a second. A lot of your follow-on capital is typically, of course, in the form of angel investment. There's a lot of folks that could play that role, but they're not, again, connected to those networks. They have the wherewithal, they have the definition of an accredited investor on paper, but again, not in those networks. And talent. And so when you think about folks that could be on someone's management team or be on someone's board, again, you have so many disconnected networks out there. So what we're suggesting is that by really thinking more about the networking, the communications, the day-to-day processes, how do you infuse inclusion into that, where you begin to create a new normal? And we'll talk more about that new normal concept shortly. Wasn't too much, was it, Teresa?
That was perfect.
Okay, good.
Thank you.
Okay. So my name is Dan Kinkead. I'm the Director for Projects for Detroit Future City, the Implementation Office. And I think as Kyle Polk had mentioned in the previous segment, I worked with Kyle, Teresa, many others, so local Boston-based landscape design firm, London-based engineering firm, some other national players to actually create the Detroit Future City Strategic Framework, which we launched in January of this year. Was asked to take on the director role to get things moving, to actually do something that we don't typically do, where the framework that we developed, not necessarily a master plan, was developed obviously outside the city government, right? And because of that, as it emerged, I think there was a real interest in seeing it implemented, and we actually put together an implementation office to drive it. You don't typically do that. And I think we've been able to see already the fruits of our labor kind of come together with a number of things underway, including 36 pilot projects moving forward in the city, doing a number of things, many of which are actually relevant to the conversation today. And also making sure that we build on some of the key objectives of our work that I think are highly relevant for the conversation now. The first is the fundamental need to be much more strategic and coordinated in our decision making. So often cities will generate master plans. They're very prescriptive. They tell you exactly what to do. Detroit Future City does not do that. In fact, it's a framework that accommodates decision making. It informs it, but everybody has the opportunity to make a decision to do what they need to do, but we try to coordinate that a bit better. In the last 2.5 years, we've had $430 million deployed in the city of Detroit by the top 10 philanthropic institutions. Many of us would question the impact of that money, and it's not any fault of the individual funders themselves, but it's because we've not really had the instrument like Detroit Future City to properly coordinate those investments, and I think now we do. And that has a direct relationship to what we can do here, as was mentioned earlier, in a very deliberate way. The second thing is that we have the ability to transform in Detroit what are typically defined as liabilities into tremendous assets. Those very things that hold us back, that define our degree of failure, can actually be our biggest success. And they're essential to us moving forward. And lastly, the idea of this fundamental, diversified, distributed, and equitable decision-making instrument itself, as a kind of legacy of something coming out of this work, I think provides everybody now an opportunity to be equally informed. Right? This isn't a situation where only the corporate elite or the city government itself or state government or even federal government have the keys to the castle. Everybody can see where this is. It is incumbent upon others then, whether it's providing capital or advising folks, to make sure that they can utilize those tools to their biggest effect. Now, before I go a little bit further, I want to lay out for you that why this conversation about innovation in a city like Detroit, particularly in dealing with innovation and the issue of inequality, why this is so critical. If you think about Detroit's condition, I'm just going to rattle off some statistics for you, many of which you might know, but we'll paint the picture for you. So Detroit has gone from an overall population peak in 1955 of about 1.86 million down to about 700,000 people. In that time, in the last 10 years, in fact, we lost 25% of overall population. 48% in that same 10 years, 48% of our 5 to 9-year-olds, right? So that you can begin to see what's happening there, and people with the ability to make a decision to leave are doing so, right? Beyond that, if you look at the overall labor force for working age folks, and I'm quoting some statistics that Teresa and Kyle have put together, so I'll take the liberty to do that. Nearly 50% of our overall labor force, 25 to 64, of our population are not part of the active labor force. That's half the working age population overall. If you dig a little bit deeper, you find also that 20% of our overall population of the same age does not have a high school diploma. That's 50% higher than the national average. Even in the folks who do have high school diplomas, the calculations are a little over 40% of our population is functionally illiterate. We have major issues with Detroit, that the concept of innovation and innovative development, innovative production and technology, these aren't just the kind of cherry on top for us, right? This is fundamental to our existence. We have to make this work. It has to be inclusive. It has to be fundamentally equitable. And with that in mind, I think it's important to also point out that in a city that is 83% African American, only 15% of the firms with employees, and I think Teresa and I and others and Kyle feel this is an important statistic, because those firms with employees actually they can scale, right? They can have bigger economic impact. Only 15% of those firms are owned by African Americans. So there's already this embedded inequity, and you can't have 15% of anything pull the weight of 83% of something else. This idea that some things can move forward and that this rising tide will come and all boats will be lifted is fundamentally flawed. It hasn't happened, and it needs to change. And so for us, I think as we've looked at this comprehensively across the city and across the work that we've developed, the ability to translate these liabilities into assets is a key point. The ability to begin to look at the fact that we have all this available land, right? 20 square miles of perfectly vacant land, not a structure on it. That's the size of Manhattan, right? We have over 40 square miles if you begin to think about the additional land with vacant structures on that. That can become something, right? If you think about the vacant structures that we have, numerous, including commercial and industrial structures. If you begin to think about the legacy of manufacturing and fabrication in a city like Detroit, which is typically defined as a kind of dinosaur, right? All of these things, these issues, these liabilities can be turned on their head, right? The available land, well, we have the ability now to use our land to institute green infrastructure projects that can sustain our city overall and manage our stormwater runoff and can actually provide jobs along the way. We can actually use that land to grow food, to grow energy, biomass, and switchgrass. That can provide employment for a number of people. We can also use that land to begin to develop aquaculture systems and a whole host of other things that we look forward 50, 60, 70 years from now. The issues that we're facing in Detroit aren't going to be the same things, and globally we're going to be dealing with overall food shortages. So Detroit can actually be the leader in developing a self-sustaining system to actually feed its population overall. These are things that we can begin to change, right? The available buildings, right? We have a number of available defunct industrial buildings out there. The floor plates are far too small for modern industry, but they're incredibly robust structurally. They've got big water, big power, 480 kV typically. You're looking at sites that have very accommodating zoning. These sites are now being seen as really strong incubators. And you're seeing those actually in tight networks in areas that we've defined as these live-make districts. These areas begin to actually foster opportunity for a host of folks if we can begin to equip folks and provide appropriate capital sources and really fundamentally change the way lending is handled and a whole other host of things. Those things begin to I think change the equation in Detroit. I want to say one other thing here too, that on the strategic coordination point, it's not just enough to begin to flip some of these things on their heads and find opportunities within them. We also have to realize that there are larger systemic issues and often physically based issues that define some of the bigger challenges that we face in Detroit. And these include things like transportation, right? A fifth of our population doesn't have access to a private vehicle. In a city that's dominated by the car with a woefully inadequate public transportation system, we're really limiting opportunity here. In fact, of the Detroiters who are working, 61% work outside the city, and 70% of the jobs in the city go to the folks who live outside the city. So you have this big switch, right? So the service sector jobs that are out in the suburbs, the folks will go out there, and the professional services jobs that are in the city and downtown go to the folks that are outside the city. You have this real fundamental inequity then in the ability to actually get to your own job, right? And a lot of us have heard this recently as some big trouble with our public transportation system. So how do we make strategically coordinated decisions around where we make those investments for innovation, right? How do we begin to actually build on the manufacturing legacy then, right, which is typically seen as a liability? How do we build on that manufacturing legacy to actually begin to create new opportunities? And we're already seeing that. A lot of small-scale fabrication. You're really beginning to see things churn where the large-scale vertical integration model that dominated Detroit, right, and created firms with 300,000 people in the city alone for one, right, are now transforming into an agglomeration economy where we have a number of small-scale enterprises producing goods and services, sharing them and sharing knowledge and ideas, where you can actually develop a more resilient network even within that manufacturing network. When one firm goes down, you lose 5 people, you don't lose 300,000, right? And you can pick it back up and you can keep regenerating. Detroit needs to kind of get back to that model where it started, and we're beginning to see opportunities for that now. So.
I'm going to stand. It's easier to talk standing. And I'm going to tell a little story about some work that we did in Pakistan last fall. The reason I'm going to tell this story is because sometimes I think it's easier to see things more clearly if you step outside your context. And also, I personally find it easier to work from the specific to the general. So I thought I'd tell you a very specific story. My name's Harry West, and I work for a company called Profit, which is a global brand marketing and innovation consultancy. I live here in the Boston area, so I guess that makes me part of the innovation economy here. That gives me right to speak, right? The project we were working on in Pakistan was to figure out ways to get money to about 5 million of the poorest women in Pakistan. The world is really concerned to make sure that people there are peaceful. It's an unequal society, and there is a potential for revolution. And Pakistan is comfortably nestled between Iran, Afghanistan, China, and India. It has 180 million people, and it has nuclear weapons. So the world is quite concerned to make sure that it stays peaceful, and money is being pumped in and distributed to the poorest people to try to elevate them and keep the society stable. It is stable, it's a democracy, and there was a peaceful transition from one regime to another just this year. So our challenge was, how do you get money from the central government to the 5 million poorest women in the country, in a country that is plagued with corruption and abuse of power, and bribery is everywhere. How do you do this to women who are illiterate, have no access to a bank, and are completely powerless? How do you do that without too much of the money disappearing along the way? So the going-in assumption, what we were told, was that the problem was these women are financially illiterate. They just don't understand. And the solution is mobile banking. Okay, that was the going-in assumption. So I built a team around mobile banking expertise. So I arrived in Pakistan last September. It was just me and a colleague, Rachel Lehrer, a very talented design strategist from Continuum, just up the road, another member of the innovation economy here. And we began to talk to these women. We went out into the slums in the cities and out into some pretty remote villages in the countryside to talk to very poor women to understand, how would you get money to them? And we learned some stuff, which is kind of interesting given that we're not from Pakistan. And the government of Pakistan is in Pakistan. And the banks trying to get the money to these women are also in Pakistan. What we learned was that these women are completely illiterate. Illiteracy beyond anything that I have come across anywhere else in the world. So illiterate, they can't. The standard of literacy in Pakistan, by the way, is to be able to write your own name. That's it. They fail that test. They cannot read, they cannot write, they cannot be part of any system that requires strict syntax. Many women do not know their own name, their own legal name. They know their nickname. Hi, I'm Bob. They don't know your legal name, which is, I presume, Robert. So it's a very difficult system, completely illiterate. However, they are not financially illiterate. When you're trying to raise a family on $4 a day, family of 6 on $4 a day, and that includes everything, food, rent, transportation, education, everything. When you're that poor, you have to be pretty savvy about money in order to make it work. So what we learned was these women were not financially literate at all. They're pretty smart. It's just they couldn't read. And finally we learned that they didn't have cell phones. So mobile banking probably wasn't going to work. Now, this was confusing to the government because they had a database, and by everybody's name, legal name, there was a cell phone number. Well, it turns out in order to get the money, the women had to give a cell phone number. So they gave a cell phone number. The amount of money was about $10 a month, which was about 10% of their income. It was enough for them to figure out how to write something that looked like a mobile phone number on a form, or get somebody to write it for them so they could get the money. So how do you get the money to them then? Well, we were working very closely with HBL, which is the largest bank in Pakistan. About this time, I realized that my team in Boston, the experts on app development, mobile phone application development, wasn't going to be that useful. And then the government of Pakistan kindly stepped in and basically prevented us from renewing our visas or getting any visas to anybody else. So we were forced to build a team in Pakistan, which turned out to be an absolutely wonderful thing. So we hired Nadia Khan, who was a brilliant facilitator from Little Village in southern Punjab. We hired Zahir and Sarah, who were two very young, very talented, completely green designers from Lahore. We hired Shehar, who was this slightly aristocratic woman from Lahore who spoke beautiful English and beautiful Urdu and possible Saraiki and a little bit of Punjabi. So And then we hired Abbas Bukhari, who was from a little village outside Multan, who spoke barely any English, just enough, but he spoke fluent Saraiki. And together we pulled together this team, a local team, to innovate, which was not the plan, but it turned out to be very effective. And what we realized was we had to find a way to help these women get into the banking system even though they couldn't read or write. And we had to help the bank understand how to communicate with people who can't read and write, how to build a system that actually worked for their customers, which they hadn't thought about before. And the solution, as it turned out, was fairly straightforward. We used photographs. We just created a series of photographs that showed every step of how you get money out of the system if you're working with an agent, or if you're in the town, if you're working with an ATM. I'll talk about ATMs because that's probably more easy for us to relate to. But imagine the problem of a woman who can't read or write. She's been given a debit card. She knows there's $10 in that machine, and she's trying to get the money out of it. There are so many things that can go wrong. For example, ATMs all designed to be read. When you put in a PIN code, you go from left to right, right? But in Urdu, in the culture in Pakistan, you go from right to left. And when you do that on a screen, what do you see on the screen? You just see a bunch of asterisks, right? So you get no feedback that the system's not working. And you have 3 attempts, and your card is swallowed up by the machine, and that's it. Your money is gone, and you may never be able to get to it again. Solution? Symmetric PIN codes. It doesn't matter. Tiny, tiny detail, but the bank hadn't thought about it, and with that solution, suddenly it enables women who are illiterate to connect with the machine more easily. So we came up with little ideas like that, and a system of photographs to show people how to use the machine, how to use an agent, and now the system's beginning to work a little bit better. Less of the money is being siphoned off through corruption. And this is what's most important, is the bank is finding a way to actually make money, to actually be profitable by serving the poorest women in Pakistan. And so that's the end of my story, and I actually wrote down some lessons that might be useful here. One was that to solve a problem, you have to get down to a level of detail that generalities and platitudes don't help. The bank, the World Bank, the government of Pakistan had been operating at a very high level, but they hadn't got down to the level of detail to understand why the system was breaking down. Secondly, that for a solution to be viable, it also has to be commercially viable. If the bank can't make money serving the poorest women, then the poorest women will not be served. That's how it works. Thirdly, the background that I had, and the rest of the team from Boston, was really developed in the dark satanic mills of commercial innovation, working for companies like Procter & Gamble and American Express and stuff like that. That's how we learn to do what we do. It turns out those skills are very, very useful in social innovation. And we probably need a little bit more of that sort of commercial approach in social innovation. Fourthly, there's some really smart people in these communities. The level of education in Pakistan is incredibly low, and yet we could, within a very short period of time, pull together a pretty sophisticated team, and by the end of the project, they knew how to do this. So there's a team in Pakistan now that knows how to do this and can continue to do this type of work. You don't have to bring in, not everybody has to come in from the outside. You can build a local team. And I guess the last point I want to make is that poverty and inequality is relative. It may be that inequality is increasing in the United States, but it's decreasing in Mexico right now. And the two may be related, you know. That's maybe an inevitable consequence of the global economy that we're in, is as the Gini coefficient globally goes down, it's going up in this country.
Great, thank you. Thanks to all the panelists for that. I want to highlight what was hearing people talk about their work and their insights on this. A couple of things jump out that link to some of the earlier panels that we heard in the conference. One, Harry's point about really having to get into the details to find solutions makes me think of Kyle Polk's work on the assets in Detroit. Shannon Powell talking about how deeply they're delving into the assets in Atlanta. And I think so this point about really doing great asset mapping, really understanding the problems, the assets, the solutions, the sort of thing, it seems to be one of the themes coming out of the conference. The second one is that process is important because places are so different. The other theme that, as an audience member for the first panel, is one of the things that really came up, is this fact about the fact that cities are so different, regions are so different, and this attempt to adopt solutions that worked other places. You might get lucky, right? And once in a while, I think people get lucky once in a while enough that this seems to, it goes forward as a way that produces success. It probably produces success randomly. It's not the way forward, right? You cannot generally import solutions that worked in another place to your place because you don't have the same assets, you don't have the same stakeholders, you don't have the same culture. One of the other, I think, real themes of the conference, and Darrin's work spoke to it, Bob's work spoke to it, is this question around how deeply social innovative processes are. And so we seem to have this kind of, these two kind of forces on the innovation economy. The first is, Bob made this point, Harry made this point, the solutions, the entrepreneurs, the businesses have to align with market forces. And market forces today are much more brutal and they change much more quickly than they have at any other time. So alignment in terms of the solutions, in terms of the products, in terms of the business processes have to be aligned with market forces. At the same time, innovation is such a deeply social process. And I think for those of us who work in innovation-related industries, and that's probably most of us in this room, we recognize that the inputs here, who you work with, to Darrin's point, who you work with, who you do projects with, who you think of when you think of experts, who you think of when you think of needing capital or giving capital, these are social processes. And this is the threat a little bit, that you have on one end this kind of demands of the market to be absolutely in alignment with market pressures. But the second piece being that the inputs, the participants, the rewards are deeply, deeply, deeply shaped by social processes. And this is the fear that in terms of reproduction of social processes. And then the third point, and I think Dan Kinkead made this really well, is that this is sort of an epochal moment when we think about cities that really are looking for a new growth trajectory. These cannot be marginal plays. This cannot be, we're going to tinker here, we're going to tinker here, we're going to tinker here. This has to be at least a recognition. You don't necessarily need a large-scale strategy. So I'm not, promoting that every city go out and do a strategy on the kind of comprehensiveness of Detroit Future City or some of these other efforts that we've seen nationally. But these piecemeal solutions, especially in the kind of weak market cities, probably aren't going to get you very far. And so I want to talk a little bit, get some responses from the panelists on some of these questions. Would love to hear people's thoughts, and maybe Darrin, you can kick us off here. In terms of the social networking, the importance of social processes, the importance of networks in this economy, how do we think about you've given us some of the solutions, right? Thinking about bringing in diverse expert networks, these sorts of things. Kind of broadly, can you draw out, there are people in the audience who are from philanthropy, from cities, from the private sector. Give some practical advice for some of these people in terms of what you've seen work in your own work, what you think is transferable.
Sure. Thanks, Teresa. So let me first provide a little bit of context from the standpoint of why today there are so many minority companies without employees. We've heard some of the data around that, and we know that and I'll put this out as a complementary strategy. You know, sole proprietors, there's always going to be a place for that component, but we certainly need more businesses that can, you know, create jobs. But let's go back for just a moment and think about growing typically businesses of scale that can you know, allow you to employ. If we go back to, you know, your 60s, et cetera, when you had the beginnings of access to capital sort of strategies. But the reason for the government even stepping in to provide such, you know, strategies was that you basically had a group of potential entrepreneurs disconnected from capital networks. So what do you do when you don't have the ability or access to real money? You do the best you can with what you have. Typically businesses that do not require much capital. So there's no mystery why you see so many service-oriented companies across the entire country led by minorities, because those did not require much capital. And then we went into this phase of, you know, access to bank capital, et cetera. Great, but when we start talking about businesses that can scale and have a higher risk profile, you know, that's typically not going to get funded by a bank. And I have honestly never done an access to capital panel discussion. And when it comes to start talking about access to equity capital and private investment, the energy that is all of a sudden created by a group of folks that are typically not in those kind of discussions. You don't typically have the equity capital sort of conversation. So I'm saying all that to say that is a network. The equity capital process is typically a network. You know, folks being introduced by folks that they know, that remind them of themselves, et cetera. And so the process from idea conception to funding is a series of networks. When it's time for an incubator or an accelerator to vet deals, they call folks that they know to vet those deals. When it comes time to start surrounding that emerging company with talent, they call folks that they know to be on the management team. When it comes time to further invest, they call folks that they know, et cetera. And so what we're suggesting is that to your question, Teresa, for the philanthropic community, for example, and there's so many ways to approach this, but I would offer that we should think about ways to incentivize networking, incentivize the development of new relationships. And what do I mean by incentivize? And now the most direct and impactful form of that, of course, is if your funding source is telling you you have to do it or you may not get funded, that's obviously incentive, right? But there's a variety of ways to incentivize. You've got to provide some intervention, some catalyst that breaks up a normal, everyday, standard process. And what I suggest and offer is, we've got this array of issues. We've heard about poverty, we've heard about illiteracy, we've heard about just disenfranchised communities. And so often folks need visual role models to see themselves doing what others have been doing. So what we're suggesting is, when you think about role models, there are a litany of very talented, and let's just pick on the African American and Hispanic community for a moment, a litany of talented individuals that could become more ingrained, more part of the DNA of these innovation networks, and then could be in turn visual examples to others that too is a process that I can follow. That's not a day-to-day visual process for many in the minority community to see themselves running a major tech company or whatever it may be. And so you have folks that have the skill sets, education. I can give you all sorts of examples of these talent networks. There's a lot of professional associations. I mentioned a few. And they are, in fact, now beginning to think about how they reinvent themselves, because again, most came together in civil rights eras, and now it's time to really think about other ways to engage. And so a real quick example of something we're very excited about, and we're doing some work here in Detroit with the New Economy Initiative. And we are, one of our clients is the Henry Ford Innovation Institute. And as we were talking about their commercialization process, same thing. This gets to Harry's point about the details. You know, you've got to understand what goes on really on a day-to-day basis to inject a solution into it. And so, because we've had a lot of experience in understanding the commercialization process, I'm talking to the folks at Henry Ford, and we're saying, okay, you've got ideas from your medical staff that are, you know, you're looking to potentially commercialize. Like any other commercialization process, once you find an idea you feel pretty good about, it's time to start hunting for capital. Might it make any sense for, in your capital search, for you to work with any of the African American or Hispanic-led private equity and venture funds that focus on healthcare technologies? And the immediate reaction was, wow, because like so many, did not know those networks even existed. And so we're now in the process of facilitating a series of discussions and gatherings so those networks can become part of a hopefully new normal. And so what we try to do is, and this, the point about the details is so, so important, because you might think you're addressing an issue as was described in your story, but unless you really understand at you know, the granular level where things may fall apart. And so often, here we are, folks that simply are too busy in many respects to develop new networks. The folks at Henry Ford, you know, once they realized that this group actually existed out there with Darrin, it strikes me that the more we talk, key point, the more we interact, key point, the more you understand what's being developed in our institution, the more you can help us share that with folks that may never see it without some sort of intervention. And so this whole notion of broadening networks, bringing folks to the table that really can play today, and let those folks become part of this solution, because they will ultimately serve as mentors and live examples to an emerging community of what also can be done other than entertainment, sports, et cetera.
Great, thank you. Anyone else want to jump in on that question? I'm seeing Bob looking.
Well, you know, I mean, you and I have had this conversation a little bit. I want to agree with you, but
Can everyone clap? Can we get it?
But in an economic frame, a little bit. I mean, not that yours wasn't, but I wouldn't want. And bear with me for a minute. So, in economics and market theory, right? We have perfect information. And racism, by the way, is considered in economics an information imperfection. You know, it's a bias that you've misjudged a good, right? So let's put that aside. And we have no transaction costs, right? And when we're talking about innovation, the distinctive change in the knowledge economy, innovation has always driven all long-term economic growth. I mean, innovation is not a new idea, right? What's different is the pace of innovation and the inputs to it and the dynamics of it. Right? So it's more knowledge-based, it requires more face-to-face interaction, it relies more on networks and on rapid innovation in products and markets and companies, right? We see more churn, more companies starting and dying. And places that have more companies dying are growing faster. I mean, it's a little counterintuitive, but the point here is that the transaction costs that you ignore in pure market theory become the critical factor, right, in allowing you to be an innovative place, to rapidly innovate, because you have to be able to transact across diverse populations and activities quickly. Transaction costs break down into finding costs and measurement costs. So think of labor markets, right? The cost of finding the employee you want, or the job you want, depending on which side of the market you're on, is a matter of finding that person and then evaluating them. It's why we tend to hire our friends, because we can find them cheaply, and we know we know who they are, right? And this is a business economic frame. It's the same point, right? These social networks define the economic transactions that affect how innovative we can be. So the comment here is just agreeing with you that these social networks are critical, and just saying that they are fundamental to the innovation economics. The one very quick example I'd use is the work we're doing in Chicago around the food cluster. Right, and starting with, when I say we, it's a group of people in Chicago, but Teresa's been advising us. The goal was to pick a cluster that's a high-growth cluster that is volatile, that's changing, that will create opportunities, and to organize it and work with it in ways that would naturally lead to inclusion. So we looked at dozens of different industries in Chicago, settled on food. So from the first detail of picking who to work with, we said and food, because it's got minority entrepreneurs in it, it's reshaping in ways that create entrepreneurship opportunities. Think about the people who cut lettuce and put it in bags, because we now want our lettuce pre-cut, It is distributed in minority neighborhoods across the whole region, but also minority neighborhoods. And now we're going out and talking to firms and organizing a group of initial leaders, and we're being very deliberate about being inclusive in that conversation, right? We're not just talking to Kraft, we're talking to Aztec Foods, and every step of the way there will be opportunities to be deliberate about this and to create new networks. And the point in terms of your conversation is in all the work all of you are doing on innovation, we've heard all these great stories yesterday and today, you're creating networks. This conference is a network. I know you were good about who you invited, but that's the detail of creating the network, and it has an economic impact.
Great, thank you. Actually, I have a live mic too. Did anyone else want to comment on that, on the social piece of this?
Just one real quick
Sure,
comment,
yeah,
just to add to Bob's real quick. One of the things that struck me too, and Teresa and I talked about this, it's important to communicate and understand that inclusion done right is not a zero-sum game. It is not a scenario where because someone else is now winning, I must be losing. And there are so many misunderstandings in that regard that often stand in the way of inclusion strategies. So what do I mean by that? Real quickly, if I go back to the buckets around more deal flow, more capital, et cetera. Well, more minorities starting businesses that can scale create jobs for everyone. It don't just create jobs for the minority population. Those businesses growing create investment opportunities for everyone, not just the minority community. And so we have a lot of talent, great ideas, et cetera, on the sidelines. And as we really think about becoming a more competitive country, we have to get those ideas and talent and capital off the sidelines and into the main game, so to speak.
Great. I did have another question, but I also realized we're going to go to about 3:10 or 3:15 on this panel because we started late. So I think now is probably a good time to switch it to the public Q&A, which will give us just about 25 minutes. So we're going to open the floor to questions. So raise your hand and we'll call on you. I saw a hand first here over on the left. Yes, please. Yeah. Hi. Yes. Oh, can we get you a live mic? Sorry. We're recording this.
Thank you. Thanks.